Hi, today we are here with Áine O'Healy, a professor in modern languages and literature at Loyola University in Los Angeles, and her research interest lies in transnational cinema, Italian screen studies, and migrant studies. And today we are here to speak about her last publication, Migrant Anxieties, and of course the topic will be around Italian cinema and migrants. So my first question for you is, how do you ended up in being interested in Italian cinema, and in which point of your career you decided to focus especially on the representation and the narratives around migrants?
Well, I did my PhD in Italian literature, and my interest in cinema studies came after that. I became interested not just in Italian cinema, but in art cinema, generally speaking. And I went back to graduate school at a certain point to study film at USC in California. And while doing that, I was offered a job as an Italianist at the university where I now teach. So it became an obvious thing to incorporate my two interests, Italian and film studies. So I began offering courses in Italian cinema and began to research and write about Italian cinema at the same time. But I'm still interested in film studies more generally and in the theory and history of film more generally. As for the specific interest in migration cinema or the representation of migrants, that evolved organically from my early introduction to film studies. I became interested in the field at a time when the dominant paradigms were psychoanalysis and feminism. And bringing those paradigms to bear on Italian cinema was difficult at first because there were no interlocutors in the field of Italian film studies for those interests at the beginning. But I did publish a bit on representations of gender and sexuality in Italian cinema way back 30 years ago. And I realized that what really interested me was the configuration of alterity, how otherness is articulated audiovisually, and what tensions are exposed culturally, what kind of cultural work these figures of alterity prompt. And then in the 90s, that's when L'America by Gianni Amelio came out. And I still remember that film as a kind of a watershed. The revelation of that film was the way in which it brought together so many central issues of Italian history, identity, and the configuration of the other, the self and the other, and the way these can get mixed up and mirror each other. That film, the encounter with that film, I'd say, was fundamental to the direction that my research took after that. But in the 90s, there weren't that many other films that came out about the figure of the migrant, and there wasn't that much interest among filmmakers in this emerging phenomenon. But then in the first decade of the 21st century, it exploded, and there were films coming out every year, very interesting films.
So there was like a radical change in the production of movie related to the migrants in the last 30 years, you said? And did you see a change also in the scholarship related to that, or not?
Oh, certainly there's been a change in the scholarship. And I wouldn't describe the change in the representation as radical at any point.
Okay.
It just became more frequent. That's all.
Yeah.
It became more commonplace. As for scholarly interest in that phenomenon, it has been much greater outside Italy than within Italy. There are a couple of books. There's a growing amount of serious scholarship being done in Italy, notably by Leonardo De Franceschi, who has a couple of books out now on this topic. But generally speaking, it was much slower to develop in Italy than outside Italy, this interest in that kind of cinema.
And so I think I have a question for you about the audience that you were thinking about when writing this book, because it's very focusing, of course, on Italian cinema. Were you thinking about scholars that are interested in cinema, or a more broad audience? Which kind of public you were thinking of?
Okay, my readership, I write for people interested in cinema mainly. So I write for scholars and students of cinema. And because most people who do cinema studies don't know about Italy, I then have to stand back and start explaining the cultural context, because it's quite particular to these images that are emerging, because they're not emerging from nowhere. They're emerging from a particular history and geography and social context. So I do elaborate on those contextual issues, because I know that the general readership in film studies is not aware of these contextual factors.
Okay, and do you think this book will have will be welcome in Italian university? Do you expect that or not?
That was never my expectation.
Okay.
However, on the basis of the book, I've just been invited to do a keynote at a film conference in Italy at Roma 3, which is very nice. But I wasn't expecting much interest, because the topic itself hasn't been of great interest to Italians.
Okay, yeah.
There's other new work happening in the Anglophone sphere that's much more interesting to Italians. For example, the new interest in comedy, in the Cinepanettone and so on, that started in the Anglophone sphere, has met with extreme interest among Italian film scholars. But the topic I'm working on, much less so. So I was gratified that somebody in Italy had read my book and invited me to speak at a conference, but it's not something that I'm particularly focused on.
Oh, okay, I see. And aside the audience, I have also has, a question about the methodology beneath your work, because the number of movies you deal with, it's huge. And the time span is very precise, 1990 until 2016. How did you decide the timing, and then how do you deal with the production?
I'm not entirely sure what your question is. Why did I decide to start at 1990? Because that's the year the first significant film
Okay.
engaging with Italian immigration was released, Pumero, by Michele Placido, the first film he directed about an African migrant traveling through Italy. So it wasn't something that I had much difficulty deciding, because this is the first significant film. And I was sending the book to the publisher in 2016, so the framework was self-evident.
There, yeah.
Yes.
And how do you arrive to the number of movies that you are discussing? Because I know that you know much broader production.
Yeah, I discussed 32 maybe films in the course of my book, and there were many more that I excluded from consideration because I had to give a structure to the book, and I decided to focus on clusters of films that spoke to certain topics, to certain anxieties again, because this affect of anxiety was kind of dominant in my conceptual approach to the phenomenon. Yes.
Yeah. And but you said that 2016 for you was a kind of deadline because you were submitting the book for your
Right. I mean, the book took ages to write, and for that reason, I knew that it had to end someday.
Yeah.
I could have published a book in 2012, and every year some new film came out, and I realized, no, I've got to deal with this. And this kept going on for about 5 years. So in the end, I decided I have to stop now because the films will keep coming out, but I better put an end to it somewhere.
Yeah,
So
but curiously enough, 2016 is also the year with the agreement between Europe and Turkey that changed a lot about the possibility of moving of migrants. Did you see a change in the production of movie related to migrants in Italy after 2016 or not really?
Well, the agreement with Turkey certainly affected the flow from the east, but Italy was affected also with the flow from the south, and long before the agreement between the EU and Turkey, there were the agreements between Italy and Libya. Mm-hmm. And those agreements affected the flows much more decisively, the flows of migrants, but not necessarily the representation of migration, because the phenomenon of migration to Italy has many aspects, because now there are settled migrants who've been in Italy for 30 years. They're second generations. There are even third generations. So there will still be films about migrants who have settled, who have claim to Italian citizenship, who are integrating into Italian society and meeting a whole different set of issues and problems, and these too are compelling issues for representation in cinema.
Yeah, and one curiosity, and maybe one last question: if you could add some new film that were released between 2016 or 2019, which one, or 2020, which one do you will be happy to add?
It's a good question. Actually, there haven't been a lot of films produced in the meantime, which is interesting in itself. But there was a film I kind of squeezed in at the end, and because it just came out when I had already finished the book, which was L'ordine delle cose by Andrea Segre, which is about Libya. It's about the what's happening in the detention centers in Libya, where migrants are intercepted thanks to an agreement between Italy and Libya, and pushed back to Libyan coasts and then incarcerated indefinitely under horrific conditions. And Segre made this film, I think, in 2017. I would have liked to give it a more central place in my book, but I was able to work it into one of the chapters, the chapter on borderscapes. And I was glad to be able to add that, but it was done in a hurry, and I wasn't able to develop it as much as I would have liked. But apart from that, what I find interesting now is the development of a cinema by second generation Italians, by Italians whose parents migrated to Italy. And this summer, a young man who grew up in Rome, whose name is Faim Buyan, made a film, a comedy called Bangla, which was widely distributed in Italy. It wasn't a huge commercial success, but it was distributed by Fandango, one of the major companies. And it fits in very well with the genre, with everyday comedy. And it's about, but the comedic effects of the film are generated by the problem of living between two cultures. This kid who grows up in, a neighborhood just outside Rome, who is having difficulty reconciling his Bangladeshi Muslim roots with the culture of his peers. Yeah. And it's very interesting that films like that are starting to be made in Italy, and it's a whole new turn in the phenomenon that I'm describing.
Yeah, and I think it's really needed because, several times in your book, you pointed out how Italian and Italian culture needs to work a bit more about our colonial and racist and xenophobic past. And your statement to me sound very bold and courageous in a way that I reread them and then I understood, wow, no, it's just a matter of fact. It's not a matter of courage, but it's something that I need to do as an Italian, full stop, not even as an Italian scholar. Do you have any suggestion for scholars that want to deconstruct the main narrative, but at the same time they recognize that they already inherited it in a certain extent?
Yes, well, there is actually a burgeoning literature, what's usually described as Italian post-colonial literature in Italy since 1990, written by migrants and diasporic Italian writers. And there's also a rich cultural, critical archive on this phenomenon. For example, a book came out a couple of years ago, co-edited by Caterina Romeo and Cristina Lombardi, about these writers, a co-edited book. And then last year, Caterina Romeo has come out with another book about the same phenomenon, about the roots of Italian racism and its effects, and also the way that young Italian writers of non-Italian origins have confronted this in their literature, in their novels, and their poetry and so on. So there's already a rich set of resources that I'd be happy to refer you to. Yeah. Yes.
Just a curiosity, was L'Ordine delle Cose making circulate widely in Italy? Or?
It was distributed in Italy, but
Okay.
it wasn't distributed overseas.
Overseas, okay.
Unfortunately, the distribution company has not managed it well. I was trying to get it brought to the United States, but they failed to pick up on that.
Yeah, because one of the things that struck me about this book is most of the film, even if they are Italian production, they were not making circulating in Italy. My question, maybe it's very silly, but why, in your opinion?
Well, it's a question of two things. One is the interest of producers and distributors in promoting it, and the other is the interest of audiences. Italian audiences, typically contemporary audiences, like comedies primarily, and there's still a great market for comedies, for locally produced comedies. But for dramas, Italians tend to go to see American blockbusters.
Yeah.
That's what draws the market. They like the expensive productions that come from overseas. So it's a problem. I mean, there was a period of time when Italians were the most frequent attendees in the cinema. There was there were huge audiences in the 60s, for example, but that has completely changed. And most people consume audiovisual entertainment at home. And most of these films are shown on television sooner or later, but often at 2 a.m. or something like that, when only the truly devoted will stay up to watch them or record them. So that's the problem.
Yeah, I think it is a problem, but I don't want to close our conversation on a sad note. So what about your next project? Will you work again with migrants representation, migrants narrative? Will you move somewhere else?
Well, at the moment, I'm looking at a new project, also about cinema and migration, but more broad than Italian cinema only. I'm looking at representations of transgender migrants in Europe more generally, and the very interesting theoretical issues that arise when in the representation of differently gendered people when they cross borders, the questions of identity and perception and self-identification that occur under in different cultural contexts, and that's what I'm looking at right now. Whether it will be just an article or whether it will evolve into a book, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, but that sounds very compelling, and I'm looking forward to the publication, either the book or the article.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming and having this nice conversation with me today.
Thank you, Valentina.